Imagine being disrespected in the worst way possible, not by a stranger, but by the very people sworn to protect you. Now, imagine that the person they insulted is an elderly woman who has spent her life raising children, supporting her community, and contributing to society. This is exactly what happened to Evelyn Hayes. But what followed was something she never could have predicted, and the world would never forget. In a moment that shook a nation, Evelyn's fight for dignity turned into a battle for justice, a battle that sparked a movement calling for accountability in law enforcement. The power of her story isn't just in the pain she endured, but in the courage that brought her to the front lines of a new civil rights fight. Today, we'll walk you through how one woman's experience exposed the dark side of policing and ignited a fire for change. Stay with us, because what happens next will leave you speechless. The sun had barely set on the small suburban neighborhood of Greenfield when 72-year-old Evelyn Hayes left her home for her routine evening walk. Her neighborhood, a quiet street lined with oak trees and modest homes, had always been a place of solace for Evelyn. She'd spent the better part of her life in Greenfield, watching the years pass by as she raised her children, worked as a schoolteacher, and built a network of lifelong friends. On this particular evening, Evelyn was simply headed to the corner store. She wasn't in a rush. The gentle coolness of the air was calming, and her worn shoes gently tapped the pavement as she ambled down the sidewalk. It was a ritual she had held for decades. No matter how busy life had gotten, this short walk was her time to reflect and find peace in her routine. But that evening, something would happen that would forever alter her sense of security and trust in her community. As Evelyn reached the crosswalk near the corner store, she noticed the flashing lights of a police car. At first, she paid it little mind. Perhaps they were pulling over a speeding driver, or there had been a minor disturbance somewhere down the street. But the police car stopped just a few feet away from her, its engine idling as two officers stepped out. "Ma'am, can we talk to you for a second?" the younger officer called out. Evelyn, startled by the sudden attention, nodded politely. She had lived through many such encounters in her life, mostly small-town police officers checking in or offering a friendly wave, but this felt different. The officers didn't smile or offer any pleasantries. Instead, their eyes scrutinized her, as though they had just noticed her for the first time, despite her having lived here for over 40 years. "Is there a problem, officers?" Evelyn asked, a slight quiver in her voice, her heart quickening just a bit. The older officer, who had been silently observing her, stepped forward. He looked her up and down, his eyes narrowing with an expression she couldn't quite place. Evelyn had always prided herself on her composure, but now she could feel herself growing uneasy under the officer's gaze. He was tall, well-built, and his stern face was hard to read. "You're walking in a dangerous area for someone your age," the older officer said flatly, his voice devoid of warmth. "You might get yourself hurt out here, alone. You should know better than to be out here at this time." Evelyn blinked in surprise. Her mind raced. She was an elderly woman, yes, but she had lived here long enough to know that a walk down the street at dusk wasn't a crime, let alone something that needed to be commented on by a police officer. "I've walked this street for years, officer," she replied, trying to maintain her calm. "I'm not a threat to anyone." The officer didn't respond with understanding. Instead, he sneered. "Yeah, well, times change, and so should you, old lady. This neighborhood isn't what it used to be. What if something happens to you?" The words struck Evelyn like a slap. She wasn't sure if the officer was genuinely concerned about her safety or if his words were just dripping with disdain. The casual insult stung, but it was the tone of condescension that left her feeling small. It wasn't just the words, it was the implication that because she was elderly, she was somehow an inconvenience, an afterthought to be dismissed. The younger officer, who had been standing quietly off to the side, seemed to sense the tension in the air. He shifted his weight, then, with a hesitant voice, muttered, Sir, maybe we should just let her go." But the older officer wasn't finished. "No, we're not done here. She needs to understand her place. The streets are dangerous, and she's too old to be walking around like this. People like her, they should stay home." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. People like her? The officer's words hung in the air, unspoken, yet clearly implied, old, frail, a burden. The very words seemed to slice through her sense of identity. She was more than her age, more than the wrinkles on her face or the weight of her years. She had a lifetime of memories, of contributions to the community, of love and loss, of wisdom she had earned over decades. Yet, in that moment, all she could feel was the weight of being a target of ridicule. "I don't think you have the right to talk to me like that," Evelyn said, her voice steady now, though her heart pounded in her chest. "I've lived in this neighborhood longer than both of you combined. I know how to take care of myself. You should be ashamed of how you're speaking to me." The younger officer stepped forward again, a bit more forcefully this time. "All right, let's just calm down, ma'am. No need to make this worse than it already is. But Evelyn's words had struck a nerve. She wasn't going to let it go. I haven't done anything wrong, officer, she said firmly. I'm just trying to get to the store. Is that too much to ask? You owe me an apology. The older officer didn't apologize. Instead, he scoffed. I don't owe you anything, lady. You'd be better off staying inside where you belong. The words hit her like a punch. Evelyn froze. Her mind scrambled for a response, but for the first time, she felt too small, too invisible to fight back. She had lived through decades of injustice, seen racism and discrimination in various forms, but never had she felt so humiliated in her own neighborhood, in her own community. The officers didn't stay much longer. After a few more minutes of awkward silence, they got back in their patrol car and drove off. Evelyn stood there, shaken but resolute. She took a deep breath, the cool evening air filling her lungs, but the bitterness of the encounter lingered. She wasn't just insulted by the officers, she was humiliated, dismissed, and made to feel irrelevant, all because of her age. As Evelyn made her way to the corner store, her hands shook. She was no longer in the mood for a quiet walk. The weight of what had just happened felt suffocating. She didn't know how, but she knew she would make her voice heard. Evelyn Hayes wasn't the type to make a fuss. At 72 years old, she had seen the ebb and flow of decades, weathered personal losses, and even endured societal changes that many people around her found difficult to accept. She had learned to take things in stride, to give people the benefit of the doubt, and to stay out of the spotlight. But something about the way the officers had spoken to her on that fateful evening had shattered the carefully cultivated peace she had spent years building. And as the days passed, Evelyn realized she was not alone in feeling a sense of injustice. The incident that night did not remain confined to the streets of Greenfield. It didn't take long for a local resident, who had witnessed the exchange, to pull out their phone and record the exchange between Evelyn and the officers. The video, though brief, was enough to capture the sting of the officers' words and the humbling silence of Evelyn. Within hours, the clip had found its way onto social media, where it was shared, commented on, and reshared again and again. It wasn't long before the video went viral. The first spark, the video that went viral. It was early the next morning when Marissa, Evelyn's daughter, woke up to a flood of messages on her phone. At first, she was confused. Texts from old friends, family members, and even acquaintances flooded her inbox. Then came the phone calls. Each one more frantic than the last. She hadn't heard anything about the incident herself. After all, Evelyn had just mentioned the encounter in passing the night before, making it seem like just another irritating but ultimately forgettable moment. But what Marissa learned that morning would change everything. Mom's on the news, Marissa's brother, Calvin, said, his voice low and full of disbelief. I've been getting messages all morning. On the news? What are you talking about? Marissa asked, still groggy. Check the video, Calvin replied, sending her the link. It's gone viral. Marissa clicked the link, the video loading on her phone. It didn't take long for the raw, unfiltered anger she had felt as a daughter to rise in her chest. She watched the video again, this time listening more closely to the officer's condescending words, hearing the way he treated her mother with so little respect. She watched as Evelyn tried to defend herself, her voice faltering, trying not to let the insult land. She saw how, in just a few seconds, her mother's dignity was shredded by the dismissive tone of the officer's words. The video ended abruptly, but the impact was undeniable. The next few days felt like a whirlwind for the Hayes family. The video quickly spread beyond Greenfield and exploded across social media. Evelyn's story became more than just a local incident, it became a symbol of a deeper issue that resonated with thousands of people across the country: ageism, disrespect for the elderly, and the mistreatment of vulnerable individuals at the hands of law enforcement. Social media explosion, a call for justice. Marissa's phone buzzed constantly. By the afternoon, people from all walks of life, some known to the family, others complete strangers, had begun to share the video, using hashtags like #RespectElderly, #JusticeForEvelyn, and #PoliceReform. The video made its way onto Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Blogs, news outlets, and even viral video channels picked it up. A wave of public outrage began to build, initially from a small group of activists and concerned citizens who saw the incident for what it was: an abuse of power. But as the video gained traction, the story reached national proportions. By the time Evelyn's daughter appeared on live television to give a public statement, the #JusticeForEvelyn had already garnered millions of views and shares. Public outrage poured in from every corner of the United States. One of the first to speak out was social justice advocate Rosa Hernandez, who shared her thoughts in an impassioned tweet: "This is what happens when society ignores the elderly. We must demand change in how law enforcement treats our vulnerable citizens." #Justice for Evelyn. Hernandez's tweet quickly went viral, leading to a flood of similar posts from other public figures, community leaders, and everyday citizens who had been moved by the video. In the days that followed, hashtags began trending nationwide. #ElderRightsNow and #EndAgeism in law enforcement took off, capturing the attention of not just activists but also news outlets and politicians. Calls for police accountability reached a fever pitch. Community response, a groundswell of support. Greenfield, a town that had once been quiet and largely removed from the larger cultural and political battles, now found itself at the center of a national discussion about police treatment of vulnerable populations. Protesters gathered outside the local police station, holding signs that read, "Respect the elderly," and "Accountability for police actions." Among the protesters were Evelyn's neighbors, old friends from the community who had known her for years. They were the people who had seen Evelyn raise her children, teach in the local school, and support every local charity and event. These were the people who had seen her stand strong in the face of adversity, and they knew that the elderly woman who had spent a lifetime contributing to her community deserved respect. Marissa stood beside her mother at the first rally outside Greenfield's police station. Evelyn was overwhelmed by the outpouring of support, but there was a quiet strength in her that she had not felt before. She had lived for decades in this small town, and now, it felt as if the entire community was rallying behind her. The signs, the chants, and the passionate speeches from the protesters all echoed the same demand: accountability. "I never thought it would come to this," Evelyn said, her voice thick with emotion. "But I'm proud of all of you. I'm proud of the community for standing with me." The rally outside the police station became a focal point for discussions about how law enforcement interacted with marginalized groups, particularly the elderly. Civil rights groups reached out to the Hayes family, offering support, legal counsel, and resources to navigate the growing media frenzy. It was clear that this incident wasn't just about Evelyn anymore. It was about a larger issue: the way vulnerable people, especially the elderly, were often treated with disdain or indifference by law enforcement. Mainstream media attention, the shift toward systemic change. As the story of Evelyn's mistreatment spread, mainstream media outlets began to cover it with a focus not only on the officer's behavior but also on the systemic issues that allowed such behavior to persist. Television stations aired interviews with local residents, activists, and legal experts, all calling for a re-examination of police conduct, particularly in relation to elderly citizens. Evelyn found herself, much to her surprise, being interviewed by news outlets. She wasn't a person who sought the limelight, but the growing media attention made it clear that her experience had struck a chord across the nation. The interviewers were kind but firm, asking her questions about how she felt in the aftermath of the incident and whether she felt that the police department had done enough to address the situation. Her answer was clear and simple: no, they haven't. They need to listen to people like me, and they need to change how they treat people who are vulnerable. I didn't ask for this attention, but now that I have it, I won't back down. The media attention became a turning point. It was no longer just Evelyn's personal story, it was a call for reform. Politicians began to weigh in, with some demanding a full investigation into the officer's actions and others calling for broader changes in law enforcement policies regarding interactions with elderly citizens. The momentum was undeniable. What had started as a local incident had transformed into a nationwide conversation about ageism, police accountability, and the need for reform within law enforcement. As Evelyn sat in her living room, watching the news coverage unfold, she couldn't help but feel a sense of both sadness and pride. The incident had been painful, but the way her community, her nation, had rallied around her was something she never could have imagined. The wave of support gave her a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in a long while, Evelyn felt that her voice mattered. She knew that the road ahead would be long and challenging. There would be protests to attend, legal battles to fight, and the inevitable pushback from those who wanted to dismiss her story as just another isolated incident. But Evelyn was resolute. The spark of outrage had been ignited, and she would be there to fan the flames, demanding justice not just for herself, but for all those who had been silenced by a system that failed to respect the elderly. Her fight had just begun, and she wasn't going to stop now. Evelyn Hayes never imagined that a brief, tense encounter with two police officers would escalate into a nationwide movement. But as the days passed, the wave of public outrage did not subside. If anything, it grew. The grassroots movement for justice, born from a single incident, had now transformed into a full-blown call for police accountability, especially when it came to interactions with vulnerable groups. Yet, despite the widespread support, there was still a crucial question hanging in the air: would the system hold the officers accountable for their actions? The investigation begins. As the viral video spread across the internet, local authorities could no longer ignore the public outcry. Greenfield's police department, which had prided itself on being a small-town, close-knit force, suddenly found itself under a microscope. The sheriff's office had already issued a brief statement, expressing regret over the incident and assuring the public that they would be conducting an internal investigation. But for many, the statement was nothing more than a hollow attempt to placate the growing anger. Evelyn, though appreciative of the apology, knew that words alone wouldn't suffice. She had heard those kinds of empty assurances before. Too many times, public officials had pledged to do better without following through. What was different now was the sheer volume of public support behind her. It was impossible to ignore. Marissa, Evelyn's daughter, had been speaking to attorneys and advocacy groups since the story began to spread. The legal side of things was complicated, but the more Marissa spoke with civil rights lawyers, the clearer it became that there was a real possibility for meaningful change, but only if they fought for it. It wasn't just about getting justice for her mother anymore. It was about ensuring that the treatment Evelyn experienced did not happen to anyone else. "There's no reason for this to be swept under the rug," Marissa said to the lawyer during one of their many late-night discussions. "We're not just going to sit back and let them pretend like this is no big deal." The lawyer nodded. "Right now, the investigation is being handled internally. But you should also consider pushing for an external review. This could set a precedent. If the police department doesn't act swiftly and decisively, we can demand that the Department of Justice get involved." Marissa took a deep breath, the weight of her mother's experience, and the national spotlight now on Greenfield, becoming more real by the day. "We'll push. We won't stop until something changes." The protests intensify. What began as small, local protests outside Greenfield's police station quickly gained momentum. Protesters, from both near and far, arrived in droves to show their support for Evelyn and demand justice. Signs bearing slogans like "Respect Elderly Lives" and "Police Accountability Now" filled the air as speeches were made, and chants echoed through the streets. Evelyn, though initially overwhelmed by the attention, found herself drawn into the cause. She attended the rallies, standing proudly with those who had supported her from the beginning. She could see the faces of the protesters. Some were elderly like her, others were younger, but all shared one thing in common: a desire for change. It wasn't just about her. It was about a system that had failed to respect the elderly, that had allowed people like her to be dehumanized, and that allowed officers to wield their power unchecked. One evening, as the sun began to set, Evelyn stood before a crowd of several hundred protesters. A local activist named Sarah took the stage and called for a moment of silence for all victims of police misconduct. "We are here today," Sarah began, her voice steady and powerful, "not just to support Evelyn Hayes, but to stand with every elderly person who has been ignored, dismissed, or mistreated by the very people who are supposed to protect them. This is not just about one officer's actions, this is about systemic issues that we, as a society, can no longer afford to ignore." The crowd cheered in agreement, their voices rising in unison, a collective roar of determination. Evelyn felt a surge of emotion rise within her. She never could have imagined being at the center of something so powerful. But as she looked out at the faces around her, the young, the old, and everyone in between, she realized that the change she had hoped for was beginning to take root. It was no longer just about her. It was about the future, and the promise of a more just world for those who followed. The media's role, a double-edged sword. While the protests grew, so did the media's attention on the case. News outlets covered every angle of the story: interviews with the Hayes family, the growing protests, and the ongoing investigation into the officers involved. But with the increased media exposure came an inevitable side effect: the rise of backlash. Some people, especially those who were skeptical of the public's quick judgment, began to question whether the incident had been blown out of proportion. They accused the media of sensationalizing the event and using it as an example of everything that was wrong with the current social climate. Some defended the officers' actions, claiming that they were simply trying to protect the elderly woman from potential danger. Others accused the protesters of using the incident as a pretext to push a broader agenda. The Hayes family watched as their story became part of a larger political debate. But Evelyn refused to let the negativity deter her. She knew the facts of what had happened. The officers' words were clear, and they were wrong. There was no justifying the kind of treatment she had received, no matter the context. "You can't control how people react," Evelyn said to her daughter one evening. "But we can control how we respond. We have to keep pushing for change." The Department of Justice steps in. As the pressure mounted from all sides, it became clear that Greenfield's police department was struggling to manage the fallout. Public trust had been severely damaged, and local officials knew that the department's reputation, and their own, was on the line. After weeks of mounting public pressure and protest, Greenfield's mayor, Sarah Thompson, announced that an external investigation into the incident would be launched by the Department of Justice. The decision was not easy, and it wasn't made without intense political calculations. However, the mayor understood that the status quo was no longer tenable. There must be accountability, Mayor Thompson declared during a televised interview. This incident has highlighted the need for a deeper look into how law enforcement interacts with vulnerable populations. The Department of Justice will be conducting an independent review, and we will take action based on their findings. The announcement was met with both relief and skepticism. While many hailed it as a victory, others doubted that anything meaningful would come from it. Yet for the Hayes family and the activists who had rallied around them, the investigation was a crucial step forward. It represented the first real opportunity for the system to show that it could change. Marissa took to social media, thanking the thousands of supporters who had helped bring the issue to the forefront. "This is just the beginning," she wrote. "We will not stop until justice is served, not just for my mom, but for all those who have been mistreated and silenced." Evelyn's quiet strength. As the investigation moved forward, Evelyn continued to stand strong. She spoke to the press, participated in rallies, and kept in touch with those advocating for reform. But in quieter moments, when the cameras were off and the protests had died down, she found solace in the small things, her morning walks, sitting on her porch and watching the world go by, and reflecting on the extraordinary journey she had embarked on. She never imagined her story would become a catalyst for change. All she wanted was the respect that everyone deserved, especially the elderly. But now, as she looked out at the faces in the crowd, she realized that her fight was about more than just her own dignity. It was about ensuring that no one, young or old, would ever have to face the same treatment she had. Evelyn Hayes had become the voice for a movement that transcended generations, a movement that would continue to push for justice long after the headlines faded. The weeks following the announcement of the external investigation brought an intense period of uncertainty and anticipation for Evelyn Hayes and her family. The media continued to cover the story, but the moment the police officers involved in the incident were placed on administrative leave, the pressure didn't let up. Public demands for transparency were high, and many across the country had been waiting with bated breath to see whether the officers would be held accountable. Evelyn, once a quiet figure, had found herself thrust into the center of a nationwide conversation about respect, dignity, and justice. As the investigation unfolded, Evelyn's life was irrevocably changed. She had become more than just a victim of police disrespect. She had become the face of a larger societal issue, symbolizing the urgent need for change in law enforcement practices, particularly in how the elderly were treated. Yet, despite the pressure and constant public attention, Evelyn remained remarkably composed. She knew that her fight was not just about seeking justice for herself but ensuring that others did not have to experience the same kind of abuse. The struggle was larger than one moment, it was about an entire generation of elderly citizens who deserved dignity and respect. The investigation and its outcome. Weeks turned into months as the Department of Justice conducted its external investigation into the Greenfield Police Department. It wasn't just about evaluating the officers' behavior during that specific incident but also examining the broader patterns of conduct within the department. Throughout this time, Evelyn stayed true to her mission. She continued attending rallies, sharing her story, and meeting with activists who had been standing by her side since the beginning. She was more than just the subject of a viral video, she had become a symbol of resilience, a voice for the voiceless, and a beacon of hope for people who had long been marginalized by society. Then, the day came when the Department of Justice's report was released. It was a pivotal moment in the case. The investigation confirmed what the public had long suspected: the actions of the officers involved in the incident were a clear violation of departmental conduct and failed to uphold the dignity and respect every citizen, especially the elderly, deserved. The report stated that the officers had acted in an unprofessional and disrespectful manner, making derogatory comments to Evelyn that were not only inappropriate but also a violation of her civil rights. The investigation highlighted a pattern of similar misconduct within the department, particularly in how officers interacted with vulnerable groups. The department was found to have failed to implement adequate training or policies to prevent such behavior, and the report called for sweeping reforms to address these systemic issues. The officers were eventually terminated, and the Greenfield Police Department was placed under oversight by an independent body tasked with ensuring accountability and instituting proper training for its officers. The aftermath: a movement takes root. The report's findings sent shockwaves through Greenfield and beyond. The community, which had initially been divided over the incident, now stood united in the face of undeniable truth. Evelyn, once an ordinary elderly woman who had lived a quiet life, had become a catalyst for change. Her simple act of standing up to mistreatment had ignited a conversation that reached the highest levels of government and law enforcement. Across the country, advocacy groups began using Evelyn's story to push for legislation aimed at protecting elderly citizens from abuse and neglect, particularly in interactions with law enforcement. Local police departments around the nation began implementing new policies aimed at improving sensitivity training for officers in dealing with vulnerable populations. What had started as an act of personal defiance had now turned into a movement that was reshaping how law enforcement across the United States treated the elderly. As for Evelyn, she felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. The battle had been hard-fought, and there were moments of doubt and exhaustion along the way. But when she saw the changes unfolding, when she saw the young activists continue to fight for the rights of the elderly, when she saw her community standing together, pushing for real reform, she knew the fight had been worth it. The power of words, legacy of change. The story of Evelyn Hayes, once dismissed as a simple insult, had become a powerful testament to the impact words could have. What had started as an isolated, personal encounter with two disrespectful officers had sparked a nationwide conversation about dignity, respect, and the treatment of vulnerable citizens. The power of words, both cruel and kind, had reverberated through communities, inspiring those who had long felt voiceless to speak up, and in doing so, they were changing the landscape of social justice. The protesters who had marched for justice, the lawmakers who had listened to their calls, the activists who had kept the flame of accountability burning, all of them had a shared vision, a future where no one, no matter their age, gender, race, or background, would ever have to endure the kind of insult that Evelyn Hayes faced. Evelyn's name would go down in history, not as a victim, but as a fighter, a champion for the dignity of the elderly, and a catalyst for change in law enforcement and civil rights. Her story became a lesson for all, that one person's courage could spark a movement that ripples through an entire society, forever changing it for the better. Epilogue: the continuing fight. While the immediate results of the investigation had brought some degree of justice for Evelyn, the work was far from over. Evelyn, who had originally never sought fame or recognition, now found herself in the midst of a new journey. She was invited to speak at national conferences, to testify before legislative bodies, and to participate in discussions that would help shape the future of elder rights and police accountability. Her voice, once soft and reserved, was now one of authority and compassion. She used her platform to continue advocating for systemic changes that would protect elderly people from mistreatment. Her fight for justice had, in the end, not only improved her own life but also laid the groundwork for a future in which the dignity of the elderly would be more universally respected. She had turned her pain into purpose, and in doing so, she had sparked a revolution in how society viewed the elderly, and more importantly, how law enforcement interacted with vulnerable populations. As Evelyn looked back on the journey she had undertaken, she knew that change had come, but it was only the beginning. There was still more work to be done. And for the first time in a long time, she felt hope for the future. A future where respect, dignity, and accountability were not just ideals to be aspired to, but realities that everyone, young and old, could expect to receive. Evelyn's story was no longer just hers alone. It had become a testament to the power of one voice to make an undeniable difference. If this story moved you, don't just scroll away. Hit the like button to show your support, subscribe for more powerful stories like this, and share this video to make sure voices like Evelyn's are never silenced again. Change starts with awareness, and that begins with you.